Here's the truth. The name coffin, which drivers themselves gave to the very first sleeper berth in trucking history, wasn't a metaphor. Less than 24 inches wide, less than 36 inches tall, no heating, no emergency exit. For many drivers, it was almost literally true. That homemade wooden box was often slung right underneath a trailer. Inside it, on a winter night sometime in the 1920s, a driver would try to catch some sleep. All that surrounded him was wind whistling through gaps in hastily nailed boards and the engine roaring right overhead. And more than a few of them never woke up the next morning. Today, I'm going to take you back almost a century to understand exactly why that box came into existence, what happened inside it on the coldest nights, and a genuinely startling paradox. Plenty of drivers, fully aware of the danger, actively fought to keep it around. I'm Jake, host of Truckmen. Let's step into one of the darkest and toughest chapters in trucking history. The world before the coffin. To understand why that sleeping box came to exist, you first need to understand one thing. America in the 1920s barely had any roads to drive on. Before 1926, when the federal highway system did not even exist yet, most of the routes connecting states were nothing more than crude dirt roads. In 1912, the entire United States had about 2.2 million miles of roads, but less than 10% of them were paved or graveled. When the weather was dry, these dirt roads were passable enough. But it only took one heavy rain or the melting of winter ice for them to turn into deep mud pits that could swallow a wheel up to the axle in a matter of minutes. Travel times, as a result, were almost unbelievably long. The very first transcontinental freight trip from Philadelphia to California in 1912 took 91 days. An 81-vehicle U.S. Army convoy in 1919 took 62 days to travel from Washington to San Francisco, averaging only about 6 miles an hour. For comparison, covering that same distance today, a modern truck takes only 3 to 4 days. Driving itself was a physical ordeal. With no power steering, drivers had to grip a heavy steel wheel with both hands every time it hit a rock or dropped into a mud rut. With no shock absorbers, every jolt from the road slammed straight up through the spine. Cabs back then were mostly wide open, no doors, no windshield, so drivers took the full brunt of the winter wind, with nothing but wool blankets and heated bricks to hold on to for a few hours of makeshift warmth. And worse still, before hours of work laws came into effect in the late 1930s, there was no regulation protecting drivers whatsoever. They were pushed to run 12 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week, for pay of about $2 a day, and if the cargo got damaged, they were the ones on the hook to pay for it out of pocket. In those brutal conditions, once night fell, drivers had only 3 options for rest, and all 3 were equally bad. 3 bad options and the birth of the coffin. The first option, passing out slumped over the steering wheel or laying a few wooden boards across the seats to make a makeshift flat surface to lie on. That cramped position led to chronic back pain, and accumulated sleep deprivation caused more than a few drivers to fall into brief micro-sleeps while the truck was still moving. The second option, laying out a tarp to sleep underneath the truck or on top of the cargo. In summer, they dealt with insects, snakes, and sudden thunderstorms. In winter, lying against the freezing ground could lead to severe hypothermia, even death from exposure. The third option, renting a roadside room. It sounds the most sensible, but was nearly impossible in practice. It was too expensive for their meager pay, and it meant leaving a fully loaded truck unattended, at a time when cargo theft and fuel siphoning were rampant. Any loss could push them straight into debt, or even bankruptcy. Out of that complete dead end, the first homemade sleeping boxes were born, a purely improvised survival solution from the drivers themselves. They built them out of scrap wood, plywood from shipping crates, and salvaged sheet metal, with no engineering calculations or safety standards whatsoever. These boxes were mounted wherever there was any spare room to use, on top of the cab, wedged right behind the cab, or, most dangerously of all, slung directly beneath the trailer, so one driver could sleep while the other kept driving. That spot quickly earned the nickname suicide box or flying coffin, because if there was an accident, a rollover, or an undercarriage collapse, the person inside had absolutely no way out. But the nickname coffin was never just a figure of speech. Inside that box, especially on the coldest nights, it was almost literally true. Inside the hellbox, winter nights with no heat. Picture the actual dimensions, about 24 inches wide, less than 36 inches tall. An average-sized adult lying inside could barely turn over, stretch out their legs, or sit up without hitting their head or elbow on the rough wooden walls. There was less than 30 inches of headroom, enough to make anyone feel suffocated and trapped. In summer, the sealed box with no insulation or airflow could run 9 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than outside, from directly absorbing heat off the road surface and off the scorching hot engine right next to it. The air inside was thick, oxygen-starved, soaked in sweat, and reeking of grease. But here's the real focus of today's story: winter. Wind blew straight through every gap in the hastily nailed boards, dropping the temperature inside almost down to the freezing point outside. There was no heat source of any kind. The driver's only option was to wrap up as tightly as possible in the thickest quilt he could find and try to sleep through the bone-cutting cold. Some, in a desperate attempt to stay warm, took the risk of bringing a mini gas stove or a small fuel-burning heater right into that sealed, airtight space. And that seemingly reasonable decision pushed them straight into another deadly trap, one far quieter and far more dangerous than the cold itself. The invisible danger. Carbon monoxide was produced by incomplete combustion in the diesel engine, or by the makeshift heaters themselves inside the sleeping box. With exhaust systems that frequently leaked, were dented, or ran right alongside the frame where the sleeping box was mounted, this toxic gas easily seeped up through gaps in the wooden floor and unsealed wiring holes. What made carbon monoxide the most frightening was its total invisibility. No color, no smell, no taste, no irritation of any kind. The earliest symptoms, headache, dizziness, and nausea, were extremely easy for someone already exhausted from dozens of hours of continuous driving to mistake for ordinary tiredness. And then they'd sink deeper into sleep, believing it was just the rest they needed. But in reality, the body was gradually losing consciousness, slipping into a coma, and in more than a few cases, never waking up again. Later workplace accident investigation reports documented multiple cases of drivers found with an unusually pale, discolored complexion, dead inside their own sleeping box, with the cause only confirmed after toxicology results came back. Facing every one of these deadly hazards, the suffocating heat, the bone-cutting cold, and an invisible toxic gas that could take a life during sleep, the astonishing thing is that drivers had no desire to give up this coffin at all. This is the strangest paradox in the entire story. The paradox: why they defended their own coffin. Despite every danger, many drivers back then didn't just accept these sleeping boxes, they actively spoke up to defend their existence against efforts by authorities and unions to get rid of them. The reason came down to something invisible but priceless: absolute freedom and self-reliance. In an era when the roads were desolate and there were almost no services along the way, having a sleeping space built right onto the truck meant no longer depending on finding a room every night, no longer facing prejudiced innkeepers turning them away, and most importantly, being able to stop and rest immediately, anywhere safe, instead of risking driving on half asleep just to reach a town with a place to stay. Economically, the sleeping box also served as an effective tool for protecting assets. By always staying right next to the truck, the driver could personally guard the cargo and fuel against nighttime theft. Not having to pay for lodging night after night also let them save a meaningful amount to send home to family. And for team drivers taking turns behind the wheel, this cramped space let the truck run almost non-stop, day and night, cutting delivery times down to the bare minimum. In other words, in an era with no system to support them, those drivers became the system themselves, accepting a trade-off of physical safety in exchange for keeping control over their own lives, mile after mile. That's the story from nearly a century ago. But compared to today's truck cabs, the gulf in how far things have evolved is almost unbelievable, and it comes with a cost nobody would have expected. From coffin to a palace on wheels. Recognizing that urgent need, truck manufacturers began building sleeping berths directly into their factory designs. In 1929, Mack introduced the first commercial model with a factory-installed bed option. In 1933, Kenworth hit a major milestone by designing a sleeping compartment that opened directly into the driving cab, letting drivers lie completely flat for the first time without ever stepping out into the cold. In 1947, Kenworth went further and released a sleeping compartment with a separate partition wall, adding privacy for team drivers. And in 1953, Freightliner introduced a design with the bed mounted over the cab, a way to work around total length regulations while freeing up more room for the cargo trailer. By the 21st century, the sleeper cab had transformed completely. Ceilings nearly 8 feet high let drivers stand fully upright and move around comfortably. Power-adjustable mattresses, air conditioning that runs off auxiliary power without the engine on, a refrigerator, a microwave, a satellite internet-connected TV, all of it turns the cab into a miniature studio apartment, on par with any modern living space. But that remarkable evolution comes with a deep paradox. A century ago, drivers endured physical torture in exchange for absolute freedom. Today, inside a top-of-the-line comfortable cab, they are under comprehensive surveillance instead. An electronic logging device that hard locks their hours by law, a GPS constantly reporting their location back to dispatch, and an artificial intelligence-powered camera pointed straight at their face to detect signs of drowsiness. They are physically safer now. But that spirit of freedom that once defined an entire generation of highway drivers, is it still intact? From a cramped, freezing, homemade wooden box riddled with carbon monoxide poisoning risk, to a modern cab with ceilings nearly 8 feet high and all the amenities of a small apartment, that's been nearly a century of trucking's journey. But in exchange for that comfort and safety comes a network of digital surveillance that the coffin generation of drivers never had to face. Next time you see a modern truck cab go by on the highway, remember, nearly a century ago, some men slept in a freezing box with no heat and no emergency exit, simply because they believed it was a fair price to pay to hold on to their own freedom. If you are an actual driver, what do you think about the trade-off between modern comfort and the freedom the previous generation risked their lives to hold on to? And if you have never driven a truck, what part of this coffin story surprised you the most? Drop a comment. I read every single one. Subscribe to Truckmen for more videos like this. See you on the next stretch of road.